This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In the first part to this series, we will be looking at the need for financial planning. Why bother? Surely we can leave this to somebody else, or do it later in our lives. It all starts off with looking at generations. So put up a timeline, and we get Generation Jones, followed by the baby boomer generation. Then came Generation X, Generation Y, or the millennials as we call them. Currently we are in Generation Z, the silent generation, and we don't know what the next generation will be called. In Generation Jones we find they didn't have much to spend their money on. Food, education, bus and train fares, and generally keeping up with the Joneses. Then we got to the next generation, or the baby boomers, and we found that they had to add in consumerism, the cost of buying your first washing machine, car and house. In Generation X, we saw added to the list of items in the family budget, not the cost of haircuts, but rather housing and the first emergence of an oil crisis. But they carried on. Things began to change in Generation Y. They had the same costs as previous generations, but added to this was the cost of acquiring and maintaining technology. The oil crisis seemed to disappear for a while. Then life changed. The change came from Alan Greenspan and Bill Clinton. They looked at America and said, stuff the cost of building houses for people, let people rather borrow and build their own houses. This changed life as we know it, because we went from the TV soap operas of the 70s, one guy and his wife sitting at home, to the far more complicated family of today with a far bigger spend. Governments have looked at this and said, how do we provide these families with a medical scheme, unemployment benefits, other social security benefits, a retirement package, and all that, and they've said, stuff it, let's look elsewhere. Can't we get somebody else to do the work for us? And they have found the solution in the East, where labor costs are a lot lower. So in Generation Z, or the millennials, we are looking at a new set of problems. They've got the usual spends, but now we've got the additional costs of wine factor and the mall. Children spending a lot more money added to their parents' spend. Then there's the cost of technology, upgrading technology, and now the additional costs of cell phones and data contracts. Also, the properties acquired over the past 10 years have to be maintained and serviced, and that's also straining family budgets. This has caused oil prices to go through the roof, from about $20 a barrel 10 years ago to above $110 today, or in rand terms, from 150 rand a barrel to nearly 1,000 rand a barrel. At the same time, interest rates have declined as governments have struggled to keep the whole thing going. This has placed an enormous burden on pensioners who require interest receipts to keep their pensions going. So today we have the emergence of a new energy crisis where the total cost of all energies is exceeding the consumer price index. So we take a look at all of those personalities and we say things are changing. Perhaps we should announce a new generation in 2010. And we're going to call them Generation Bieber. What is Generation Bieber looking at today? The biggest difference is in life expectancy. In Generation Jones, life expectancy was 55 to 60. A Bieber born today will live to more than 100. This creates an enormous strain on family budgets. Because when parents look at it, they say, well, we have paid for the next generation, and we've done that for generations. But today in the Bieber generation, we've got it, the parents are saying, well, we're not dead yet, we're going to live for a long time. And there's not that extra money to spend on the generation before us. We have to look after ourselves. And grannies are looking at it and saying, well, we used to fund the generations below us, i.e. our grandchildren, and we've done that for a long time, but we also have to cut back as we could well live to 100 years old. So the Bieber generation is looking at the same challenges as the Z generation or the millennials, but added to this are going to be the enormous costs of energy, retirement and early retirement, and their costs of their own private health care. When we look at financial planning, we've always looked at it in 4 phases of a suspension bridge. 0 to 23, get educated, get started, 23 to 35, then accumulate wealth from 35 to 65 and retire at 65. But today that is changing, because the parents are sitting in the getting started phase and they are surrounded by the baby boomer who are currently retiring with insufficient money to live on, and their children who are still dependent on them. So they've become the meat in the sandwich. This creates the domino family effect. The breadwinner and spouse and 3 children is the way we used to look at it. But now in one family we are also getting 4 grandparents sitting up the top, all dependent on a breadwinner in the middle. So when it comes to financial planning, what we are finding is it stays the same in the first block, 0 to 23, getting educated. But the second block endures for nearly 30 years as people try to support themselves, their children, and their parents. And by the time they get to the accumulation phase, they are already over the age of 50. And there is not enough time left to create a pension to retire on. This can create all sorts of family spins, as if finances go out of the window, we see the whole family starting to be affected, and before we know what's happening, everybody is knocking each other over. Added to this problem are the enormous number of people living in South Africa today. There are 50 million of us. 1.4 million of them are disabled. Then come 2 million AIDS orphans. Then 10 million children on child grants, and 8 million children who look to their parents for support. Then there are 2 million destitute old age pensioners. That's half of South Africa dependent on somebody else. But more recently we have seen the emergence of a new group of people who need to be supported, 4 million who are unemployed, and a staggering 10 million who are not even looking for work. 75% of South Africa is dependent on somebody else. There are 13 million people who do have employment, but 9 million of them are below the tax threshold of 5,000 rands per month. And this leaves a small working class of about 4 million people, most of them sitting in the middle working class. And we have to ask the question, well, how many fat cats are there? Well, there are only about 150,000 South Africans who earn more than 500,000 per year. The problem with a graduate is that they are aspiring to become workers and sit in the last 2 blocks. The requirement of them will be to pay a lot of income tax. The moral to the story is quite simply this. We got ourselves educated in the first place so we could look after ourselves. But in the new society and order that we are going to live in, we have to recognize that if there is one disaster on a breadwinner, the domino effect starts and it can knock over a lot of others. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 2 of this series, we are going to look at the debt trap and where it all goes wrong for graduates. Let's look at starting off a career and a family. Some say this is initially find a job, graduate, and get on with it and start working. But it doesn't work out like that. In the first 5 years, many graduates go like this. They start working. They need a car. Then they need a faster car. Then they need digs, so they buy a house. And then they need all the toys that they've promised themselves while they were studying. So they buy the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone, and the Mac before they've even bought an iron. And then they find a spouse. And so it progresses to getting shacked up, knocked up, hitched, married, divorced, in-laws and outlaws before they know where they are. The result of all of this is that within 5 years of leaving university, they are hopelessly in debt. And this has a serious effect on their lives. They land up flat broke at 25 to 30 years old, with no escape, with commitments. A car takes 5 years to pay off. A cell phone contract is 2 years, even if the cell phone is lost. The house commitment is 20 years, and a spouse, pets, and kids is a lifetime sentence. All of this adds up to a debt trap, and the problem is the social diseases, or the dreaded Ds, as we call it, that can follow. These include down and out, depressed, drunk, drugs, dumped, or even divorced. All of them in one way or another caused by too much debt. Many students ask, how would I have played it if I had had the opportunity again? Well, perhaps this would be a simpler idea. Start working. Establish your package. Then establish how much cash you're actually going to take home. Then manage your risks of living in the new South Africa and create a family budget. And after that, one can read the menu of life and decide which of all these lovely things you'd like to have. But the important message is you don't need to get them all in the first year after graduation. So here are some useful tips for starting off. Get some help with your finances. See a professional financial advisor. And live for 2 years and consolidate your long-term commitments. Then think 10 times before you borrow. Cash cards and internet banking are all that you need as a recent graduate. There is no need to go out and accumulate a whole bunch of credit cards. And then let your earning potential grow until you find out what you really want to do with your life. Remember, your career spans 40 years. If you keep your health, and falling into the debt trap is the easiest way to lose your health. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 3 of this series, we will be looking at establishing your take-home salary. There is an enormous difference between the package that you are promised at recruitment, that's the cost to your employer, and the amount that you're actually going to take home. That's probably 30% less. In South Africa, the president has many dependents, and we joke about it often. What we have to see is that somebody has to pay for it. Initially, as a graduate, you will be in the bottom tax brackets, and you will pay very little tax. But quite quickly, you will progress into the middle bracket where taxes reach 30 to 35%. And as you progress in your career, you may even pay as much as 40% tax on income over 617,000 rands per year. If one looks at who pays the tax in South Africa, there are very few taxpayers. In the bottom brackets, there are about 1 million taxpayers. In the middle order brackets, where graduates will be starting off, there are another 2 million or so taxpayers. And wealthy taxpayers in South Africa, those who earn over 400,000 rand a year, total a mere 378,000. And even then, once your taxes are paid, there are other costs to consider. Medical aid. There are currently 8 million South Africans on medical aid. 42 million South Africans are not. Once you are a graduate, you will probably be required to get your own medical aid. The most basic medical aid costs currently 892 rand per member per month, or 2,273 rand per family. An executive medical aid, which covers all your medical costs, costs 3,365 rand per month, or 8,000 rand per family. Don't think you're going to get much of it back from tax. Only 230 rand per month for the first 2 member and dependent, and thereafter SARS will only pay 154 rand per month per member. All in, SARS never pays more than 25% of the total cost of your medical aid. And even then it's not finished. There are other deductions on your payslip. Your group life cover, income protection, dread disease cover, unemployment insurance fund deductions, etc. The important thing is, where does it all go? A first payslip may look something like this. Draw up a T account. There's the basic salary, if you're lucky, 25,000 rand a month. But the deductions on a salary like this would be UIF 125 rand a month, Provident Fund 3,200 rand per month, medical aid 1,200 rand per month, income tax 3,556, group life cover 272, income protection 182, total deductions 8,535 rand per month against 25,000 leaves a take-home package of 16,465 rand per month. The mistake many graduates make is that they think they will be taking home the full 25,000. It's very useful to download a spreadsheet as is offered by Sanlam. Off their website, one can get an Excel spreadsheet which will show you there's your salary or your take-home package. Now start on the costs of living. It can easily cost 5,000 rand a month to put a roof over your head. Then, to feed yourself at 100 rand per day will cost you 3,000 rand a month. Your wheels won't cost you less than 5,000 rand per month, and that's most of the salary gone, before we've even looked at the cost of utilities, that's your phones, data contracts, etc., further education, sport, recreation, and miscellaneous. As can be seen from the example, total expenses there on a very moderate lifestyle, totaling 19,250. Putting it all together, one can see that a graduate, even with a take-home package of 16,000 rands per month, can easily land up with a shortfall. So we draw a picture of it, and that's very impressive, and the answer used to be to go off to a financial institution and borrow to see yourself through. However, today with the National Credit Act, this is easier said than done, and we find that short-term loans are only enough to see you through a couple of months. So here are some useful tips for starting off. Get the basic tools of your trade, but be modest. To do your job properly, you need a car, a cell phone, basic computers, and basic digs. Then one has to secure your future in the new South Africa. What are the risks that you face? What could lead to your financial downfall? We need to analyze the options available for medical aid, dread diseases, illness, sickness benefits, unemployment insurance, and income protection. We will be looking at all of this in later packages in the series. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 4 of this series, we will be looking at the question of, do I need a funeral plan or life insurance after graduation? Well, you wake up on a Saturday morning and you put on the TV to watch some sport, and there's the guy selling funeral plans. He says, for R1 a day, that's just 30 Rand a month, we can provide you with a funeral. Well, here's a little reality. Your employer could probably provide the same package for about 10 Rand per month. Remember, funeral plans sold over the television or the internet take no account of your age or your health. You are a graduate, and thus you are entitled to a far better deal. Do you need life insurance? One needs to assess your risk to others. One needs to say, who will repay your student loan? Who will pay for your medical and funeral costs? And who will you leave behind? A partner or a child? Other dependents? How big is your family? Then we need to consider your age and your risk profile so that we can get you the best deal. We also need to consider, does your employer provide you with group life cover or a funeral plan? Do you have existing policies? We need to consult a financial advisor to get you the right cover, very importantly, at the right price. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 5 of this series, we are looking at the question of, do I need permanent health insurance or income protection or dreaded disease cover after graduation? Let's start off with a little reality check. How long must an employer pay an employee who cannot work? Answer, just 10 days. Thereafter, they have to keep your job open for you, but they don't have to pay you. The risks in South Africa are always there. There are accidents, illness, and violence and crime to consider. These cannot be avoided, even if you are young and healthy. And there is little in the way of state assistance to help you if you fall. Even if you are totally disabled, the maximum grant you can receive from state is currently 1,200 Rand per month. There is some good news, however. You are a young graduate, so your risks relative to the rest of South Africa are considerably less. So, with the right products, the premiums are far lower for a graduate than for others. Then we need to consider, does your employer provide you with permanent health insurance, or do you have existing policies? In order to get this right, you need to consult an advisor to get you the right cover at the right price. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 6 of this series, we are looking at the issues of, should I be saving after graduation, and how do I save? Well, let's start off by looking at the phases of financial planning. You spend the first 23 years of your life getting educated. You are now embarking on the second phase of the suspension bridge, which is getting started, 23 to 35. During that period, you are acquiring assets, your first house, your first car, etc. There's not a lot of extra cash lying around. It is only when you get to the third phase of your financial planning, 35 to 65, that you begin to accumulate major amounts of money. And then, of course, comes retirement. The priorities after graduation are to insure your risks in the new South Africa. You simply cannot save enough to cover a disaster. Then comes the priority of paying off your student loan. And then comes the question of starting to save. When it comes to saving, there are different types of saving products. There are cash and protected investments. Then there are bonds and balanced funds. and then comes investment in shares and international shares. It is very important that one looks at the time horizon associated with investment. If one is going to invest in cash and protected products, one invests for 1 to 3 years. Bonds and balanced funds 5 to 10 years, and shares and international shares 10 to 15 years. Then one pastes over that your age. So if you're currently 25 and you're investing for 15 years, you will get your money back when you are 40. What one is looking to do is to say that when one saves, one is looking at a time horizon of 1 to 3 years. That's a conservative investment strategy. When one invests in bonds and balanced funds, one is investing for the next 10 years. You'll only get your money back when you're 35 or so. That's a moderate investment strategy. And when one invests in shares and international shares, one has an aggressive investment strategy. The conservative investment strategy has the lowest return, going up to the maximum return which should be yielded by shares and international shares in an aggressive investment strategy. When one puts this all together, one is saying one has a small amount in a conservative war chest where money is made available immediately if you need it. One has an equally small amount in a moderate investment strategy, and one is looking to invest the maximum amount in a long-term investment strategy. Confusing, isn't it? Well, then we also have to consider, do you have all your risks covered? Are your debts repaid? And when do you want to access your savings? All of those things need to be considered before you start saving. You need to consult an advisor to get the right investment that suits your investment profile and time horizon, and that suits your tax profile, and that is available at the right price. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 7 of this series, we are looking at the urge to buy a house as soon as possible after graduating from university. Many students have done this, and some have made some very expensive mistakes. What should you be doing about it? Well, if one looks at the history of the South African residential property market, we see that in the 1970s there was a 100% increase in the price of property in South Africa. Then we went into decline. And then around about 2000, we saw the biggest increase in South African property prices that has ever happened. In fact, that was irrational exuberance. But it all came to an unfortunate end around about 2008. The picture we see today is that since 2005, property prices have been falling. And today, the real growth in property prices is almost non-existent. That leads us to the conclusion that there is no immediate haste to get into the residential property market because prices are not running away. There is no rush, but what is important to consider is the costs associated with residential property. If you go out there to buy a house, the first thing that you will encounter is transfer duty. There's not much transfer duty on your first house. For example, on a 1 million rand house, the transfer duty is only 12,000 rand. But it increases quite quickly thereafter. And it is important to note that it is very difficult to include the transfer duty in your bond application. That is a trick that is associated with our past that is no longer allowed. So you will have to come up with the transfer duty in cash when buying your first house, probably together with the deposit. What we see is that interest rates have declined in recent years, and currently you can probably get a home loan at around about a 9% interest charge. That's not the big problem. The big problem has become the other costs associated with owning a home. How do you fill it with household effect? The modern home probably contains in excess of 500,000 rands worth of household effects. Then you have to insure the property and its contents. You have to pay rates and taxes, electricity and water, security companies, and upkeep, never ending, on and on. In fact, the definition of a property owner is somebody who goes to a hardware store too often. These costs are often more than the bond and have to be considered if you are going to enter the residential property market. It is all a 20-year commitment owning a home, and it is not a decision that should be taken lightly. Rather, consolidate your financial position and take your time to establish where you want to live and can you afford a residential property in the new South Africa today. This training intervention is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 8 of this series, we will be starting on an introduction to financial planning, saving, investment, speculating and gambling, but concentrating on saving. The 4 outcomes that are required in this topic are to be able to differentiate between what is investing, saving, trading, speculating and gambling, and to look at their significance in the field of investment. We also need to look at what are investment goals and associated time horizons, and also what are asset allocations and what do they mean in developing and maintaining a portfolio. Let's start off with understanding risk. Draw up a timeline, left and right, and put on the left side zero risk and on the right side insane risk. Saving has zero risk. Investment has a bit more risk, speculating even more risk, and then gambling is insane risk. Under zero risk we have saving, where a return of only 3 to 6% can be anticipated. With investment, pre-tax returns are between 8 and 12%. Perhaps with speculating, the return rises to 12 to 20%. And then when one is gambling, we take on an infinite risk. Why not just save? Why don't we simply take no risks? Well, the problem is inflation. Start with 100 Rand in April 2009, and applying the inflation rate, that would grow to nearly 120 Rand today. But one sees that after-tax returns have dropped, and we see after-tax returns are actually today below the inflation rate. Thus, to have any hope of real growth, one has to look for growth in equities. And applying the Johannesburg Stock Exchange All-Share Index, we see that investments have grown to around 160 after capital gains tax. Moral to the story, we need to look for higher returns. We cannot just rely on interest. The Consumer Price Index is rising at about 6% per annum. That's how 100 Rand in 2009 must be worth 120 Rand today. But one has to look at other factors. Remuneration has, over the last 3 years, outstripped inflation. So, if you keep to your job, you should be getting more wealthy. But other things are also growing faster than the inflation rate. There's your Consumer Price Index. But if one looks at the cost of fuels, we can see that they are way above the Consumer Price Index. And then if we look at electricity today, that's way above the Consumer Price Index. So when we put it all together over a 3-year period, in red at the bottom we have the Consumer Price Index, but we see that energy prices are rising much faster. This will ultimately drag up the inflation rate to well above the risk-free rate of return. In recent times, the head of the Reserve Bank, Jill Marcus, and the Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, have had to keep interest rates as low as they possibly can to stimulate the economy. Thus, the outlook for any increase in interest rates is pretty dismal. The moral to the story so far is that it's going to take more than a lifetime to get rich earning interest alone. You could even get poorer, and you can quote me on that. Is there any need for saving in South Africa today? Well, yes, there is. There's always a need for a savings account to finance deposits on items that you may wish to purchase on credit, to finance state occasions, and any other events that fall outside your monthly budget. We don't want to borrow for these things, and sometimes we actually can't because of the requirements of the National Credit Act. In the next interventions, we will look at the prospects for investment, speculation, and gambling. This video production is brought to you by the Sanlam Foundation. In part 9 of this series, we are looking at investment. What is the difference between saving and investment? Why don't we simply just save and take no risk at all? In the previous video we saw that the problem with saving is that it's very difficult to keep ahead of the consumer price index, and to find any real growth we have to go looking for equities, but that involves taking on risk. The JSE All Share Index has performed quite nicely between 2009 and 2012, rising from a lowest level of about 18,000 points to about 36,000 points today. That's a wonderful ride, and if one can smooth the curve, that would solve our problems. But unfortunately, it's not that easy. We see that across the curve, sometimes there are some big dips. For example, in July-August 2011, the market fell from 32,000 points to 28,000. That's where some people lost a lot of money. So we have to be able to smooth out the curve. The only way that this can be done is by spreading the risk over a period of time. So this is where we put in the element of a time horizon. If you want your cash immediately, well then you must use a savings account. And then, on the extreme version, if you carry on gambling for long enough, you will make a profit. But nobody's going to live that long. If we now go and look at the investment block in green and explode that out, we find that in order to manage the risk on an investment, if it is a blue chip share in domestic markets, we need to be in the market for 5 to 10 years. Other shares, a bit longer, and then finally on international shares, 10 to 15 years. Now add a further complication. Income tax. The Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan, has to keep the state coffers full. So now we have different taxes associated with different forms of investment income. So the individual taxpayer can be taxed at a rate of up to 40%. Some income is exempt. Some income is subject to capital gains tax at 13%. And then there are annual allowances which should also be utilized. These range between 30,000 Rand for capital gains tax and 32,000 Rand for interest receipts. And from 2014 there are even going to be special savings accounts where the income is tax-free, subject to limits. The wealthy use trusts, and they have a tax rate of between 26.7% for capital and 40% for revenue. Sometimes it's even possible to get that lower using a special technique called attribution, but we don't know how long that's going to last. Some prefer insurance policies. They have a maximum tax rate of 30% for revenue income and 10% for capital. And then others have been using companies. However, with the introduction of dividends tax, this is not the right way to go at the moment. We have to apply all of this to the different categories of investment. Do you maintain a share portfolio, which is flexible, but very high maintenance and thus expensive to administer? Or do you use unit trusts, not so flexible, but lower in maintenance because somebody else does the work for you, and essentially cheaper? Or do you use an endowment policy, again not so flexible, a potential tax saving, but you are locked in for 5 years? Or do you use a retirement annuity, also not flexible, but gives the greatest tax saving of all, but you are locked into your investment until you retire? We have to overall consider the difference between speculation and investment. Investment is a science, speculation is an art. Financial institutions spend fortunes on technology and research to create answers that marry risk and reward. That's a science. This sort of knowledge is simply inaccessible to the man in the street. That's why you need a financial advisor to facilitate that your investments are properly looked after in a proper scientific and researched manner.